Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this very critical hearing. The threat from ISIS seems to be growing exponentially. In the summer, we were told there were about 15,000 soldiers. Now we're told that there's between 40 and 80,000 soldiers. We're training 5,000 moderate Syrians right now. Our best hope and our best opportunity appears to me to be to intercept this transport of funds coming from the sale of oil. Of course, there's extortion and ransoms and other means. It does beg the question whether we have enough military intel ops on ground to make these interceptions. Another area of real opportunity is, of course, with data mining software that's available. I've met with FinCEN and with OFAC several times as chairman of the Task Force on Terrorism, also many national software companies. And with the very sophisticated software available, I do hope that the department is making every effort to utilize this software to engage these funds as they get into the international financial system. Thank you. I yield back.
We now turn to North Carolina, Mr. Pittenger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Cohen, following up on Congressman Pierce's questions, during Operation Desert Storm, we had an average of 1,100 strikes a day. 12 years later, against Saddam Hussein, Iraqi freedom, we had 800 strikes a day. In the last 2 months, against ISIS, we've had a total of 412 strikes, 7 average a day. Is this limited amount of airstrikes as a result of not having the intel on the ground, as a result of precipitously pulling out our forces several months ago, or is it a lack of the will by the administration to take out particularly these transfer of oil out of country?
Congressman, I'm not sure it's either of those, but I'm really not in a position to comment on the military campaign.
Secretary Cohen, are you in dialogue with the DOD? Are you in conversation? Are you in meetings with them regarding our approach and how we would seek to dismantle, disrupt, and destroy these transports of oil out of country? Given that that is the most significant manner of which that ISIS has obtained their $1 to $2 million of revenue a day.
Absolutely. And the conversations that I'm involved in, as you might expect, are conversations about policy and broad approach. I don't sit at CENTCOM. I'm not doing targeting on the day-in, day-out basis. But in terms of the overall policy direction and the contribution that I cited that the Defense Department can make to efforts to undermine ISIL's financial strength, that is something that, as part of the overall integrated strategy that General Allen is leading, is part of the conversation.
Do you believe it, number one, is it in our best interest and also the best strategy if we would seek to destroy all of the transports out of country?
All of the illicit oil transport?
Illicit transport of oil out of country.
It would seem to me to be one of the ways that we can impair the oil trade is to stop them from bringing it out of the country. What I am not in a position to comment on is the practicality of doing that. It's just not my area of expertise.
I appreciate that. Please convey our continued concerns on the matter of the limited approach that we've had in terms of our commitment to airstrikes in various capacities, but particularly related to trying to disrupt the income flow back to the ISIS. On another matter, I mentioned earlier the availability of technology. There's very robust analytic software programs. I've worked for 12 years with major software companies, originally related to Medicaid fraud. But in these discussions, we've transferred now on and talking about how we can the terrorist funding and the transfer of it outside the United States and inside the United States. And as such, I wrote Jennifer Calvary, the Director of Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, on September the 4th, and requested a meeting to make sure that the department is utilizing every available possible analytic support software available. I'd appreciate your help and response so I could meet with Ms. Calvary. It'd be most appreciated.
Certainly, Congressman, and I can tell you that FinCEN, which Director Calvary oversees, has recently gone through an IT enhancement. It has some advanced analytical tools available to it, and they are using those tools to go through the reports that they receive from U.S. financial institutions to identify potential fundraising for ISIL and to push that out on a very rapid basis to our law enforcement colleagues. So that is happening, but I will convey your request.
If you could help bring about a meeting with her, I would very much appreciate it. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Gurule, in your testimony, you stated that there were only 2 banks who had violated our Bank Secrecy Act, the Arab Bank in Jordan and the Arab Bank in New York, if I heard correctly. And that's just over the last 10 years. Is that as a result of our lack of capacity to track these folks, or are there others who are complicit that we haven't been successful yet in tracking?
That's the question. The question is, why is it that FinCEN, I think, has done a fairly good job in terms of sanctioning banks that do not have compliant AML, anti-money laundering regimes that comply with the BSA. But with respect to counter-terrorist financing, it doesn't seem to be a priority. And I wonder, is that because of a lack of resources, personnel within FinCEN? Maybe there's just not enough bodies to be engaged in oversight with respect to whether these banks pose a high risk for terrorist financing, or perhaps the weak spot may be with the other federal regulators, that the other federal regulators aren't focusing and emphasizing on whether or not these banks are in compliance with the counter-terrorist financing regulations under the BSA. But it seems to me that it's unacceptable to have only 2 banks, where if you look at the actual orders issued by FinCEN, the only 2 banks where I could find references in those orders to threats regarding terrorist financing.
Yes, sir. In that light, as we look at our partners throughout the world, we have relationships with them, many of whom we give tens and even hundreds of millions of dollars of foreign aid. It's always of concern to me of how we are not honored by our relationships with our partners, and particularly in this situation that's so critical for our national security and for theirs as well. To what extent, what would you advise us as a Congress in going forward, and how we could put greater pressure on these respective countries and their banks to be in compliance with our BSA requirements?
One point that I haven't made in my testimony today has to do with the Anti-Terrorism Act. And it does have a civil provision that authorizes private litigants to bring civil tort actions against individuals that commit acts of international terrorism. And I think that statute could be enhanced through amendment to make it a more effective remedy for victims of terrorism, including people, entities that aid and abet terrorists. For example, banks that knowingly provide financial services and transfer money to suspected terrorists. There's several problems with the current legislation as it stands. One, it doesn't explicitly authorize aiding and abetting. And if we're going after the banks, they're really the aiders and abettors. So the plaintiffs are left with the dilemma of having to prove that the bank is primarily responsible for international terrorism through secondary action by being an aider and abettor with respect to the acts of terrorists. So I think in that way we could unleash plaintiffs, we could unleash an army of litigants to go after banks and charities and other entities that are facilitating the financing of terrorism. And again, I think from an equitable standpoint, it's the right thing to do. These are victims. These are the surviving family members of victims of violent acts of terrorism.
Thank you.